We welcome tonight David Kersey, who was present at the Pentagon on 9/11. You can see on the insert in your program his professional accomplishments. We are thankful for David's involvement here at First Baptist Church. He is the grandson of Dr. E.T. Clark, who was pastor here when this sanctuary was built in 1928. Thank you, David, for your willingness to share your reflections on that day.
Don't get nervous, this isn't my speech. When I was trying to come up with a title for my message this evening, I stumbled upon the thought of "Let Us Never Forget." And it reminded me of a story that some of you may have heard of. The older gentleman who is in a nursing home in his final years and has been there just a short time, so he's trying to get to know the ladies in the home and make his impression on them. So he goes up to several. He sees seated at a picnic table one day, and he says, "I bet you can't guess how old I am." And they said, "Well, I'll tell you what. If you take off your shirt and turn around 3 times, I bet we can tell you to the month." So the old guy kind of up for the challenge, so he takes off his shirt, feeling good. He turns around 3 times, and they look at each other, and they all 3 say, "In March, you're going to be 92. And he says, "Wow, how in the world did you know that?" And they said, "Because you told us yesterday." Well, I've not had a chance to share this story before, and I'm honored to be here in a church home that's meant so much to me and my family over the last 80-plus years, as Laurie had said. 10 years ago today, President George W. Bush wrote in his diary, "The Pearl Harbor of the 21st century happened today." And indeed, September 11th, 2001 is a day that shall live in infamy. Anyone over the age of about 18 or 19 now remembers where they were and what they were doing on that momentous day. There are so many amazing stories out there, stories of courage, of victories, but also of struggles and of losses. And we all wrestle with how to resolve those memories that are burned into our psyche in various ways. We want to heal, but in a very real way, something whispers to us that we must never forget. In early 2000, I was assigned to work on the Wedge 1 renovation of the Pentagon. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Pentagon, it's a massive building. It's over 6.5 million square feet of space. It has over 17 miles of corridors. The center courtyard is 5 acres in size, and that's in the center of the building. And each of the 5 sides of the building is over 900 feet in length, making it almost a mile around the circumference of the outside of the building. And as some of you may know, the original groundbreaking for the Pentagon actually occurred on September 11th, 1941, 60 years to the day before the terrorist attacks. There had never been a major renovation of the Pentagon until the Pentagon renovation team, started in the mid-1990s. The construction company that I was working for, AMEC, had been awarded the renovation of Wedge 1, and that included a complete gutting and renovation of 1/5 of the Pentagon, which comprised about 1.2 million square feet of space. Part of our contract also included a significant change order to furnish and install blast-resistant windows that were around the entire perimeter of the building. And it also included structural steel that supported those windows. And it was these windows and the structural steel that would later serve a pretty significant function in absorbing the impact of the plane as it hit the building on that September morning. I was the vice president in charge of the project for our company on site. And as you might imagine, with over 1.2 million square feet of space, we had to have a number of phased turnover dates for occupying the building. And these dates range from March 2001 through September 3rd, 2001, just 8 days before the attack. We achieved every one of those milestones, and we were closing out the project on September 11th. And we had about 30 people on site. We had our staff meetings on Tuesday mornings, and these generally lasted about an hour and started around 8 o'clock in the morning. So on that clear, crisp Tuesday morning in September, Towards the end of the meeting, my administrative assistant came in and handed me a note that my boss was on the phone and wanted to talk to me. He had been on vacation the week before, and he wanted to know how the turnovers had gone and get caught up to speed. But I was supposed to go on an inspection tour with the government officials at 9 o'clock that morning at Corridor 4. On the ground floor, there had been some cracks in the flooring, and we were trying to figure out why, or prove to the government why we thought that those cracks were occurring. So I was faced with a dilemma. Do I go on the government inspection tour, or do I answer the call and talk to my boss? So, what would you do? Well, I decided to answer the call and talk to my boss. So I went into my office to get on the line with him. I was on the phone for about 10 or 15 minutes when Ron Clark, our project superintendent, stuck his head in my office and motioned to me that he was going on into the building, and I assumed that he was going onto the tour. And so I figured I'd catch up with him when I got off the phone. So I relaxed into the conversation with my boss. I brought him up to speed with what was going on. And I heard someone on his end of the phone talking about New York and the World Trade Center and a plane on fire. I couldn't quite make it out. And he said, "David, did you hear that?" And I said, "Well, I didn't quite make it out." So I reached for my computer mouse to jostle my screen awake to go to an online news site to catch what was going on. The screen hadn't even cleared when I heard the loud rush of an airplane and felt 3 or 4 successive jolts. Not unlike a lot of us felt on August 23rd when we felt the earthquake. Something big had happened, and I said to Ron, "Something big just happened here. I don't know what it is. I'll call you back." So I ran outside of our office trailers, which were right next to the Pentagon, and I looked over the massive limestone walls of the Pentagon to see a mushroom cloud that had formed on the other side from where I was, and I could tell it wasn't very far away. So I gathered my personal belongings and realized I'd better get out of there now. So I started to run to my car, which was parked closer to the plume of smoke, closer to the corner of the Pentagon where it looked like something had happened. And as I ran to my car, I was starting to huff and puff a little bit, being very nervous. And I had on short sleeves shirt, and my arms started to tingle, and I wondered what was going on. But I figured, if I don't get out of here now, I never will. But I thought there might be a dirty bomb, it might be something that's harming me, I don't know what it is. So I got to my parked car. I looked at down the 900-foot face of the Pentagon, and it looked like a scene from Die Hard or some other Bruce Willis movie, something horrific. Smoke was billowing, bright flames were behind people that were running towards me. It's in times like this when, if you've been in an accident or something, it's happening pretty quickly and kind of in slow motion. It's just all very confusing. But I finally got in my car, trying to make my escape, and I realized that my car was covered in a film, and I had to actually turn on my windshield wipers to clear the windshield. It was only then that I realized that that film and what was making my arms tingle was actually the jet fuel that was falling from the mushroom cloud above. So I made my escape and drove on up to my condominium in Roslyn, which was only about 2 miles away from where I was. And on the way, fortunately, my sister called to ask if I was okay, as they had just heard that a plane or something had hit the Pentagon. So I told her I was fine and asked her to relay that to the rest of my family, knowing that the cell phone coverage would be somewhat limited for the rest of the day. When I got to my condominium building, I walked into the lobby, and I remember naively thinking, as I saw people standing around talking, I wonder if they know that anything hit the Pentagon. But I got on the elevator, went up to my floor, went to my front door, still shaking from the previous 10 minutes of confusion. Put my key in the door, tried to open it, and it wouldn't open. Tried it again, tried it 3 or 4 times, couldn't open it. Changed the key, couldn't figure it out. I finally looked at the number on the door, and it said 557, and I lived in unit 857. I was on the wrong floor. That's how confused I was. So I redirected myself, and I finally got into my condominium, and I turned on the TV just like everybody else that day. But from my 8th floor condominium building, it's a building that some of you may know if you're familiar with Arlington. It's called the Prospect House, and it overlooks Washington, D.C. It's right beside Arlington Cemetery. And one of the architectural features is floor-to-ceiling glass looking towards the city. So from there, I could not only see what was going on TV, of course, but I could see out the windows in my condominium what was happening with smoke billowing out, and quickly discerned that that plane had actually hit pretty close to where we had been working. So my boss and I decided we better call around and check to make sure that everybody that was working with us was okay. We called around, and after about 2 or 3 hours, We had identified 25 or so of the people that had been with us. Still several were missing. And by about 1 o'clock, we thought all of them were accounted for except for one. And it was Ron Clark, that gentleman who I told you, our project superintendent. I was on the phone a number of times with his wife that day, and I was the last one that she knew that had seen him. And unfortunately, he wasn't answering his Nextel cell phone. Someone had noticed that his truck was actually parked right next to where mine had been and not been moved since that morning. So no one could get in touch with him, and I continued to call around to ask other people if they had seen him, and no one had. Finally, around 1 o'clock, as I recall, I was on the phone with Ron's wife, Paulette, and she dropped the phone and started crying. I didn't know what to make of it, but fortunately, after a few minutes, she came back and she said, "Thank God, he just walked in the door." Ron had actually run to the metro stop at Pentagon City without a wallet, borrowed money, bought a metro fare to as far as it could take him, and hitchhiked the rest of the way to southern Maryland to his home. So it took him about 3 or 4 hours to get home, but he, fortunately, by God's amazing grace, everyone that I worked directly with that day had been spared. Of course, I later learned that American Airlines Flight 77 had hit the west side of the building at precisely 9:37:46 a.m. It was traveling over 500 miles an hour, and it took only 0.8 of a second to penetrate over 300 feet deep into the Pentagon. I was less than 600 feet away when I was sitting at my desk that morning, but I was supposed to have been right there. If I hadn't answered the call from my boss, I would have been innocently walking on that tour with those government officials. You know, I know it was the grace of God that saved me. And when I tell people the story, I also like to say, hey, if your boss calls, you better answer it. It might just save your life like it did mine. So I walked back to the Pentagon that afternoon because the Virginia State Police had shut off all vehicular traffic on the GW Parkway. I remember that walk seemed like one of the longest and certainly the most silent walks of my life, for nothing man-made was moving, as many of you recall. No cars, no planes, nothing. It was almost like a solemn silence that the world was recognizing that something had happened, as if the world really had stopped turning on that September morning. By 2:30 that afternoon, I was standing in the heliport on the west side of the building, staring at a broken Pentagon that had collapsed. I spent the rest of the day and the night of September 11th right there, helping to coordinate delivery of materials, helping to get firefighters and emergency crews familiar with where access points were, helping them to know where to turn on the water and how to turn off the power. I remember thinking so many times, there but for the grace of God go I. And it would really nearly bring me to tears as the devastation of what was in front of me really sunk in. But I recall my growing awareness of being in the presence of so many people who worked tirelessly to search and recover the victims, to begin to clear the debris, to piece together the fragments of the plane, and to make plans for the rebuilding and actually to get the work done. And to those that say there are no heroes in this world, well, I beg to differ with you. I just say you don't know where to look. Believe me, there are heroes among us, and I saw the faces of many that day and every day thereafter. Our company actually signed a contract on September 15th, 4 days after the attack, to rebuild the damaged Pentagon. And when we signed that contract, the Pentagon was actually still on fire. But the Penryn officials needed to go to Congress one time and get approval, and they couldn't have anything go over that amount. So we signed a contract and tried to do the best to contain that. We actually did much better than that in the end. But the rebuilding project was dubbed the Phoenix Project. And according to Greek mythology, as many of you may know, a phoenix is a bird that literally rises from its own ashes and is destined to live as long as the old self. The phoenix literally is reborn anew to live again. And our goal was to rise from the ashes, stronger and more united as a project team, as a building, but also as a symbol to our country and to the rest of the world of the strength of America. We settled on our goal to rebuild the Pentagon by September 11th, 2002. And over the next year, I witnessed the true American spirit, the American resolve to not let anything stand in our way. We had over 1,500 workers who worked many shifts a day, 2 shifts, sometimes 3, to piece together the areas of the Pentagon that had been destroyed and to actually build them better than before. During his address to the nation in the aftermath of the attacks, President Bush said, "Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve." And when we tested the foundations in the impact area where the plane had hit, we actually found that those foundations had not been disturbed, and that we could build on the very same foundations that our forefathers had placed nearly 60 years ago to the day. And I saw that American resolve, that foundation of America at work every day. Workers of every variety doing things that were well outside of their normal job descriptions, all in an effort to rebuild America and to prove that to those that did this despicable act, that they cannot destroy our country. So when I glance into the rearview mirror of my own life and see the events of 9/11 and the rebuilding that ensued, after the smoke clears from the devastation and the tragedy of the events, I see a story of grace, of perseverance, of strength, and of hope. I know that I was spared that day by God's amazing grace. And I did nothing to deserve it. It was a gift. That gift included me being spared that day, and also included me being a witness to the great American spirit that lives within each of us. That spirit that can pick up the pieces and start to rebuild with commitment and strength that we may not even know that we have. Each of us, in our own way, can be reborn anew to live again. So whether our own personal 9/11 is the explosion of a building, of a terrorist attack, or the implosion of a relationship, the death of a loved one, or an illness that enters our world, an accident, a layoff, or any other of the myriad of life's changes and losses, the best that we can do is try to pick up the pieces, have faith that the smoke will clear, and then we do start picking up the pieces and shake off the dust. And God will give us the strength that we need to move on, to rebuild our lives somehow better than before, just like the phoenix. No one knows what tomorrow brings, like it did on that sunny, crisp September morning. But I know that God has a plan, and He'll give us what we need to fulfill that plan. Our job really is to figure out what He wants us to play. So as we look into our own rearview mirrors and reflect on the past and try to figure out meaning on the road ahead, let me leave you with this simple test to figure out if your mission on earth is finished. If you're alive, it isn't. You are here for a purpose, and you have something that only you can give to the world. So take time to consider what that is. No matter what has happened, no matter what devastation occurs, we can clean up the pieces and rebuild stronger than we were before. Let us never forget.